The past year has been a wacky one, and one of the tamest reasons why may be this string of AAA surprises where big-ticket games from big publishers preview with all the red flags of a flop before releasing a perfectly fine, if not great, video game. After the horribly marketed Rainbow Six Siege and the review-rescinding Doom, we have Hitman, a non-numbered always-online episodic sequel that leaked out the gate to unimpressive footage with a whole lot less production value and budget than its predecessors. But the final $60 release that came out of it, the full experience of 6 $10 episodes, turned out fantastic. But anyone who played the first episode on release 7 months ago probably already knew that, and already wrestled with the prospect of Hitman occupying a kind of budget release corner. Square Enix's other foray with episodes just aped Telltale's strategy. It's one thing to release a game that looks and feels like a TV show episodically, but it's another to do it for a core action genre. But Hitman as a franchise is a perfect match. It's always had kind of an episodic structure. Every level is meant to be replayed over and over again without a whole lot of continuity tying them all together, and even the traditional Hitman narrative, with each level indirectly relating to a separate story of cutscenes played before and after the levels, works for episodic releases too. For those who don't know, Hitman is a game about breaking into people's turf and stealing their clothes. You have simple stealth mechanics playing into complex social mechanics, where looking and acting the part of an NPC you knock out and disrobe is used to help you get close to some terrible head honcho you're supposed to assassinate. Although it's possible to just shoot or karate chop everyone around, a heavy scoring system and low HP discourages violence and encourages you to get in and out of there, screwing up as few people's days as possible. It's always been a great little series, and this 2016 non-numbered but not a reboot sequel is actually pretty darn excellent. But apparently the last game, Absolution, was not. Not that I would know, bad reviews kept me from ever getting around to playing that one, but evidently sales were low enough back in 2013 to have the studio face layoffs, abandon their other IPs, and release this open letter hyping up the next game that reads almost like an apology for Absolution. So IO Interactive's budget for voice acting seems to have been cut, judging by how often the same voices appear on different NPCs. Although it's used on beautiful locations, the graphics tech here looks one presidential term behind the times, which is about as long as my frame rate was lagging too. Stiff animations and a cover system that feels unfinished are more forgivable hallmarks of the series' classic Eurojank, but that foreshadows another missing piece of this puzzle. Jesper Kyd's ghastly orchestral scores. But they still did it, in spite of all that. Hitman 2016 is a return to grace for the studio and the series, and one of the most enjoyable games I've played in years, even without Jesper Kyd. The new composer, Niels by Nielsen, comes into the series swinging with audio cues as bold and catchy as Kyd's best.
That's the ticket. I tell you, nothing makes you tense like thousands of people wanting to kill you.
Target down. Next up.
Sir? What?
But you gotta get used to it. That music is definitely a different style. It's a little more upbeat, it's a little more synthesized, kitschy, and vogue. Its tone is nestled right square middle in the chiseled jaw of James Bond. And that's because this is the release where Hitman realized that it's the James Bond game that the game industry has never had the guts to make. Sure, you have a long lineup of movie-licensed and original Bond games aping the films' action scenes with a genocidal amount of shooting and a mixed bag of minigame driving. Activision and EA have made plenty of efforts to gamify the action scenes of Bond movies, but they've never attempted to gamify the social fantasy of Bond movies. That is, of basically being able to spend 90 minutes fitting into a sexy party our hero's not supposed to be at. I don't know, Nightfire and GoldenEye Reloaded had a couple minutes each of non-violent party levels, but they were just kind of follow the waypoint to play the cutscene ordeals. On the other hand, Hitman's party levels are the things of legend. They are cramped mosh pits where crowds of of people are thick enough to make solid visual cover, where creating and maintaining false personalities is the actual gameplay system you're supposed to master. It's an espionage game, it's a stealth game, and can you even believe that there hasn't been a 007 stealth game this whole time? But Hitman's always been there to fill that hole, and I've always thought it was funny how righteous the series always ends up managing to be. You're always assassinating genuine villains. You're a hitman murdering people for money, right? But your targets are just never anyone's exes. If they're not an actual international Bond villain, they're someone who would die in a Bond movie anyway. They're all slimy egomaniacs with way too much money who got caught playing a hand too big.
So our client, MI6, need us to stop the ringleaders before the knock list.
Yep. Hitman 2016 is the closest thing to a James Bond game that's been made in half a decade. And Agent 47 here is video gaming's original version of James Bond. A charming Renaissance man who's good at just about everything, but also a sociopathic, emotionless robot. His perspective is a cockpit for video game players to fully immerse themselves into. Which is why you should turn these newfangled Instinct and Opportunities modes off. Instinct mode is basically X-ray vision that can see all the way through ceilings and even highlight targets and security in a thick crowd. It's overpowering, but also redundant, since your minimap shows a lot of the same stuff and your camera can peek over cover anyways. Opportunities mode is a series of nag prompts that either gives you floating waypoint markers that directly point to exactly where to go for the most discreet and creative ways to assassinate a target with no penalties or incentives prodding players to walk off that beaten path. Or you can set opportunities to a minimal mode where pop-up messages still instruct you where to go to discover a map's most tantalizing secrets, but that just felt like having pop-up excerpts from a strategy guide suddenly get slapped onto the screen in the game. It is patronizing, but I don't exactly object to these features being there at all for new players. I just hate that they're on by default and buried underneath so many menus, because what they are pretty much this game's version of easy mode. There's no difficulty selection, but there are options to turn off those hand holders, and throttle them down from full to minimal to fully off, and Hitman goes from a just kind of follow the waypoint to win the game ordeal to the experience of a lifetime. It turns into the brainiest and smartest stealth game around. It's a rewarding and oftentimes hilarious process of learning and discovery. Turn those modes off and suddenly the game becomes amazing. It becomes the Blood Money 2 you always wanted. It becomes a cure for the phantom pain. It really does scratch a lot of the itches that last year's big stealth game left me with by turning over the opposite side of Metal Gear's coin. A lack of polish on the movement and mechanics here is compensated by an overwhelming depth of replayability and complexity and a mastery of level design that just was not in MGS5. For starters, 4 of the 6 episodes are really big, loud, busy, and relatable party levels. They're the stuff of legends. The overall season is definitely loaded with the best content first, but that just means that the first 3 levels of this Hitman may be the best across the whole series, and the 2 in the middle are just pretty good compared to the rest of the whole series. But your little vacations in Paris, Italy, and Morocco directly call on Blood Money's best moments before things start to quiet down a bit later. But those first 3 really are benchmark levels for the whole series. In Sapienza, for example, you have this big complicated mansion with multiple tiers of staff and guests walking through their little schedules throughout the complex, and that would have been a whole level in the earlier games. But what wouldn't is the entire city they built outside the mansion, which is literally the majority of the map. Paris has this entire attic floor that's huge but barely used. Marrakesh has you sneaking through not just 1 but 2 mansion complexes, plus the city outside. The size and scope of these places compared to the relative detail the devs put into them compared to how much of them is actually used doesn't even start to make sense until like playthrough number 3, when you're discovering just how related stuff at very opposite ends of the map are to one another. And that is what's always been so amazing about Hitman's level design. It's that there's really a whole little world in each level, and that whole world is a puzzle in and of itself. The game seems less scripted and more organic when you know about as much of the world as your character would. After all, every one of these levels is so drastically different from the last. You start out each level lost in a scary exotic place you know nothing about, other than it's sure to be full of charming stories. So perusing stores, getting lost in the streets, and doing some good old-fashioned people watching are the routine duties for learning a Hitman level. The crazy hippie upstairs, the private detective's empty office, the gelato store, the old church down the street all become convincing, living, lived-in places that will all gradually feel like home as you develop a plan and get to work. And that's such an immersive process because of the levels' simulationist designs. These aren't painted backdrops for a shooting gallery, they're more like clockwork societies of AIs. They're mechanical dioramas that the player can tamper with, quietly, more often than not.
Hands off the diorama! I made it!
Hitman's the rare action game where there's as much, if not more, for players to see and do and think about in the relative peace and quiet of a public neighborhood as there is in the middle of a loud action set-piece car chase in a Call of Duty. Trespassing where you don't belong doesn't instantly trigger guards who shoot to kill. Instead, they politely but firmly ask you to leave. The equivalent of Metal Gear Solid's alert and evasion phase is just you trying to scurry away from someone who thinks you're lost and wants to ask you why. A thrilling chase scene can trigger from you and a guard just trying to spot each other in the thick of a huge crowd who don't have a clue. So the player's power fantasy here is truly earned, not by shooting their way through it in an exhilarating gunfight, but just by trying to fit in. And that's what I've always thought was one of the great accomplishments of this series, and how it's done some real borderline avant-garde kind of gameplay, despite being a hardcore action game about a cloned assassin asshole who travels around the world killing national stereotypes. As it turns out, a game about being a hitman turned into a game about being a spy, which may be better understood as a model for how games can be about how people act and fit in with one another. I mean, sure, in the meantime, it's also a compelling set of worthy sneaking challenges with, unlike MGS5, a working save system that really digs into my perfect stealth perfectionism. Without me even knowing it, half an hour passed of me just trying to safely take a left here. I mean, that was actually because I didn't want to change clothes or shoot anyone or cause any kind of big panic, which is my own self-imposed challenge, which also usually matches up with the developers' imposed challenges. The long lists of boxes to tick was IO's chosen method of gleaning replay value out of the game here, and when I saw so-called challenges that are just having you start in a different location from last time, the system became something that I don't know if I'm 100% on board with. If you couldn't tell, I adore this game. I truly enjoyed it, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm also driving up some tolerance for a lot of really shady bullshit, because the bullshit happens to be duct taped to a very good game. The boxes to tick here are really the least offensive offense. It's really not bullshit, it's just more like a weird little thing. They reward you with new gear and starting locations, which makes sense because the optional missions that modify targets and objective conditions keep getting harder as you play them, but I'd rather your final mission score be used for at least some of that progression. As it stands now, all it's good for is the leaderboard, and challenges feel like boxes to tick because you can rush a level, do an absolutely awful job of ruining everyone's day, but so long as you tick a few new boxes, you can be rewarded with as many level mastery fun points as you would by actually being good at the video game. Alternate ways to play these levels aren't provided just from the robust options and playstyles that story missions allow for, but also from modified missions called escalations and the player-created contracts missions. But the one that really sends me some bad vibes are the elusive target missions, which are time-locked content that goes away forever if you miss their expiration date. It's not just throwaway stuff either. The elusive missions introduce entirely new voice-acted characters with unique personalities and schedules that sometimes change the layout of the map itself. Plus, you can only play them once. You have one shot, no saves or retries, so you gotta plan on the fly and improvise, and the tension is sky high. It's great. But if you wait for video games to get cheap or reviews to come out like you should, all those extra missions are supposedly just gonna go away forever. This is how they're egging people on to buying the episodes as they come out. This is their counter strategy to smart and responsible spending. I get it, I see what they're doing, it doesn't mean I like it, that's bullshit. I mean, hardcore mode in Diablo still deletes your save every time you die, but it doesn't permanently patch itself away from all versions of the game when you die. Plus, how the hell can future historians fairly judge the acting career of Gary Busey if they can't kill him in Hitman? It's a catastrophe. For that matter, future historians, and quite likely you from 10 years from now, aren't going to be able to play the game right anyway. Because it's always online, which is just another bit of pure marketing bullshit. Hitman is a single-player game through and through. There is no need for the always online component, no matter what this FAQ says. There's no reason all this stuff couldn't be stored locally and preserved forever. But try to play it offline and all your progress vanishes. The whole challenges unlocking system goes away forever. You won't be able to unlock new gear, outfits, or spawn points, so there's no way to be anything other than a level 1 Hitman if you're playing through it offline, and that is egregious. That is putrid. And the unfortunate thing about that is that they're gonna get away with it because Hitman is the kind of killer app that would let them get away with it. So what do you do when you hate the game of their marketing, but love the game that they're marketing? I want to spread the love and see single-player games of this depth, detail, and respect for the player's intelligence come out more often, but what I don't want to do is encourage those games to keep coming out with an expiration date.
Charming. Yeah, should have brought candles.